Okay, so I'm gonna talk about recent work I've been doing in my group on the randomness of brain rhythms, and also the relationship between that and network inference for excitatory-inhibitory networks. Some of you may have heard part of this talk before in recent months. For those of you who have, there's a little surprise at the end, something completely new that might be interesting to you. Okay, so let me, oops, there we go. Okay, please interject with questions when you have any. So the beta and gamma rhythms are known as bursty rhythms. They're not straight oscillations. They go up and down. So the question is, what's the dynamical regime that underlies this burstiness? And the answer for this talk is going to be quasi-cycles. And we're going to study the statistics of how these rhythms go up and down using Fokker-Planck theory. That's work done by my PhD student, Arthur Powanwe. After that, I'll move to actually inferring EI networks. Like, these are the properties of EI networks with noise. How do you infer EI circuitry from microscopic data? And that's work done with a PhD student at Exandre, who's co-supervised by Jacob Macke. I guess he just moved to Tübingen. So, finally, a little surprise on how another way to get stochastic limit cycles is work by my PhD student, Kamyar Tavakoli. All right, so let's set up the stage here. We have ongoing voltage fluctuations in neuron populations. Those can be, measured off of the cortex, the ECOG, or off the scalp, EEG, or with electrodes such as LFPs, local field potentials, and they occur in various frequency bands. So the gamma band, typically 30 to 100, beta band 10 to 30, and there's all kinds of divisions within those bands. These rhythms are thought to play major roles in communication between brain areas, but also, manifest themselves in terms of importance for memory tasks, attention, motor control, and so on. Their statistics appear to be altered in a variety of brain disorders, such as Parkinson's, where there's maybe too much beta power, epilepsy, where there's too much gamma power, but also schizophrenia, autism, and a host of other conditions. Now, to model brain rhythms, there's a huge literature out there. They typically involve two classes of cells, E cells and I cells. And within there's two classes of models, those that deal with only inhibitory cells that really run the show. They can be coupled together through certain kinetics of synapses, and just with inhibition alone, it can synchronize, or you may have a delay that causes a synchrony. You also have synchronization with E and I cells, so-called negative feedback interactions between E and I cells. So I'm going to focus mainly on the second one here, on ping. There's a variety of other ones. John Renzel has a nice model recently that combines some features of these. And but what I'm going to say is going to apply to a variety of models. So while I'll focus on EI networks, the methodology can be applied to other ones. So the rhythms are autonomous, generally that's what we think, but they can also be induced or altered by stimulation. And by and large, the modeling has been deterministic, so there's no noise. But real brain rhythms are more and more perceived as having a significant noise component. So I'm going to focus a lot on noise. And here's data from Xing's group from macaque visual cortex. So what you see here at the top is a recording from an LFP electrode. And you see that you have these fluctuations in here. And there may be more than one rhythm going on at once here, clearly. But if you focus kind of on the fast rhythm, there are epochs squared out marked out in gray here, where the amplitude is larger than other times. And you can do a spectrogram, like a frequency time representation, and the black bars here denote epochs where there seems to be higher power. And those epochs are known as bursts. So clearly not a sine wave oscillation. It's something that kind of starts and stops seemingly randomly. You can look at the amplitude distribution from Fourier analysis. You'll see a peak, you know, around the frequency of interest, around 60 hertz here, gamma range. The phases are pretty much random. And then you can plot from data, this is Zing's data again, you can plot the frequency content. So that means what's the given frequency range that you see, but I'm plotting it as a function of the burst duration. So for example, if you have a burst of duration 0.15 here, well, burst durations of 1.5 typically have this frequency content from the data, okay? And so there's a distribution of frequencies that is correlated with the distribution of durations. And if you look at the projection of the durations alone, you'll see a range of durations. And this is, you know, healthy macaque apart from undergoing surgery here. This is the that's awake behaving macaque, and you have you have a distribution. So the mean burst duration is about, you know, 65 to 150 milliseconds. These gamma oscillations in vivo, so therefore appear as short bursts, gamma bursts, and their occurrence and duration seem to be random variables. And that's the property that we're focusing on here. And we can plot these joint distributions like I just showed you for burst duration and peak frequency to help calibrate a model and find out what range of dynamics corresponds to this. You can look at deviations from healthy burst range, which is going to be, you know, pathology. And there's more and more of this idea out there that gamma activity is nothing more than filtered noise seen through a recurrent excitatory-inhibitory network that has oscillatory properties, or if you want, it has complex eigenvalues, and the noise is just driving those modes and exciting them. But if you were to turn the noise off, you'd see a nice fixed point. That's it. I should mention this last piece of work where bursts have been suggested to be important communication events. They're like communication packets. So that's theory. We don't really know this yet, but that's an interesting perspective. Okay, so what I'm going to look at is kind of rip out the fast scale and look only on the slow scale. So the envelope phase equations for a ping model, in order to explain burst duration and burst frequency, and find out what dynamical regime matches the experiments. And in particular, I'm going to look for a theoretical expression for the mean burst duration. You know, what governs the duration of the burst? Because that's the quantity that's of interest that seems to go awry in various pathologies. And can you have some handle on what governs the burst duration? So these epochs here, what governs their duration as a function of all the biophysical parameters of the network? What matters? That's the basic question. For that, I'm going to look at a first passage time problem. So how long do you spend inside a burst, given some stochastic dynamics, for the slow envelopes? So what I'm going to be looking at is the slow envelope, or if you want, the slow amplitude waveform that wraps this fast rhythm. Okay, are we good? Any questions so far? Anybody there?
We're all here.
All righty, good. Okay, there's a new animal digging in my wall here, so I'm just trying to keep concentrated. Okay, you have, I'm at the, because I'm out in the country. So, okay, we're gonna look at a neural mass model, the Wilson-Cowan model for oscillation generation, which has been formulated in recent times, reformulated in terms of Markov chains, where you have two-state neurons. And in the limit, you can do various analyses on two-state neurons and cook up this dynamics for an EI network, in which you see the classic Wilson-Cowan for the excitatory population activity and the inhibitory population activity. And you have this nonlinearity here, E times F of SE. And SE is actually the input to the excitatory population, which comes from other excitatory cells, from inhibitory cells, and from the outside. Here's the schematic, okay? And then you have noise, which depends on the size of the population. So it's finite size noise, okay? And the noise is also time dependent in strength. So you have two Gaussian white noises that are independent. And basically this is the picture where these noise processes drive this thing, which is a nonlinear filter. And we're gonna linearize it to get, to be able to do anything with it, analytically. All right, so I'm not gonna go into the details much. You can ask questions afterwards and I'm happy to send you the paper, but you can do what's called a linear noise approximation where you rewrite these activities in terms of this change of variables, and then you get basically a linear system with 4 matrix elements and driven by noise. This is, if you want, a two-dimensional Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process in some coordinate system. And we're going to focus on the ratio of amplitudes of the two populations, just given by this, and the phase difference between the two populations. And if you do the linearization of this, you'll find eigenvalues that have them on the previous page. Lambda is minus nu plus j omega 0. And the point is here is that nu is positive, so this part is negative, okay? So you're operating the system below the Hopf bifurcation. You're on the fixed point side, and the noise is going to excite the oscillation because you have an imaginary part here. And that's the frequency, it's a deterministic quantity. That's the deterministic quantity that underlies the oscillation. If you want, this is the relaxation oscillation that you would have around the fixed point. Now you can rewrite these VE and VI as amplitude phase equations. So a slow amplitude, cosine, fast frequency, plus a phase. And same for the inhibitory population. And in here, all these parameters, A11, A12, and so on, they're all related to the cellular and connectivity parameters you had at the beginning. This is all, straightforward. But if you change the bias, the input to one cell, all these quantities change because you change the fixed point and all the linearizations are done around fixed point. So basically you have a handle on what depends on how these coefficients depend on the cellular components. Okay, so let's come to the question of what regime. So if we talk about the asynchronous activity, which is what we're seeing, it's not completely synchronized. It goes on in and out, and it's quite noisy. We are talking about a transient synchrony regime, and I'll show you that in a second. It's near but below the onset of synchrony, or near below the onset of the Hopf bifurcation. So there's no deterministic limit cycle here. It's a noise-induced rhythm, and the rhythm is generated by the noise, which can be of synaptic origin or other. While we'll be focusing on gamma rhythms from the data I showed you, this is also the conclusion that Ralph Bogatz came up with his group at Oxford in recent papers as well. It seems to be the regime for beta oscillations. So for some data that he's analyzed, it seems like if you fit the Wilson-Cowan model to his data, you get fixed point dynamics as well. All right, so here's a subspace of parameter space of the Wilson-Cowan. We look at the just two coupling coefficients here, the self-coupling coefficients. And if you look at an area up here, you notice these epochs of bursts, very much like the data. This is what it looks like here. I mean, very much, that's all in the eye of the beholder. It's a, it has stops and starts and stops and starts. And you see these bursts turn on and off, okay? If you go in this area of the parameter space, too much excitatory self-coupling, you're going to get into something that looks like an epileptic, sort of seizure or highly synchronous activity. The big band of red, that's not what we see. So what we see is more on this side. And of course, there's a few other parameters here. And we've explored mainly this area and also kind of going along this way on the, so below the Hopf curve, which is in red here. This also appears to be the regime of, these are called quasi-cycles, where the limit cycle doesn't exist, but it's induced by the noise. And San Cristobal and et al. Showed that this was also a relevant regime in their gamma wave, gamma oscillation prep back in 2015. So there's mounting evidence that this is a relevant regime. Okay, from these equations, this one here and this one here, we want to get at the envelope, which means, can I describe the envelope, the slow evolution of the amplitude of this curve here? So there's a technique to do that. There's a few techniques to do that. We were inspired very much by the work of Cindy Greenwood and Lawrence Ward and Mark McDonald back in 2015, where they apply the theorem that Cindy Greenwood and Baxendale came up with to do basically a change of coordinates to a rotating frame. And in that frame, you could look at the envelope evolution and the phase as well. What we obtain here is very, very similar to this, but we use a different technique called the stochastic averaging method. We needed to redo part of this work here because they did not include the full parameterization. We needed the noise and the eigenvalue, the real part in our problem. So we just redid it, and because of what we were doing at the time, we did this method. And you come up with these two equations, which are very similar to the ones that these people found. But now it has D and nu explicitly in there. So you see that you have an envelope amplitude. Again, that's the envelope amplitude over here, Z. And then you have theta here. So these evolve according to these two equations. Z to this order of approximation is unto itself. There's no theta in here. But the phase depends, sorry, the phase is phi, the phase depends on Z. So when the envelope goes up, the phase slows down. But the phase is basically a diffusion process. These two processes are independent Brownian motions, okay? All right, and the parameters are all here. Now with this, we can go to town and say, okay, this is the envelope. Let's see what the properties are. Let's look at the distribution of envelopes. What values of Z can you get? You solve the Fokker-Planck equation in the stationary state for this. This is the answer, okay? So you get, it's basically Z e to the minus Z squared. So it's something that goes up and down. It has a peak at this value R here. And this ratio, so nu over D is basically a meta parameter in the whole problem. We're going to call it R. And it's going to govern the distance to the bifurcation. So in fact, we're going to look at dynamics here, far from the bifurcation, and then we're going to increase R and increase it again and increase it again as you get closer. Here are examples that you have for A, B, C, D. You're getting closer and closer to the bifurcation. So as you get closer to the bifurcation, you see that okay, there's a ton of little tiny bursts in here, but they're not very large in amplitude and they're short. As you get closer to the bifurcation, you get more and more pronounced bursts, and they tend to be longer. All right. Now, there's a technical detail. How exactly do you define a burst here? That's a huge problem experimentally and theoretically, and the results will depend quantitatively on what you choose. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. So what we want is, okay, so you notice that as you get closer to the bifurcation, the distribution of bursts, the burst durations, gets longer and longer. So, and the inset here is 0 to 5. Okay. This is roughly the range that corresponds to the experimental data between 65 and 150 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds. This is reminiscent of the data. This as well for other data sets that we've seen. And our goal is to calculate the duration of one of these events, okay? So you need to set yourself a bar somewhere. You can't put the bar too low because you're gonna pick up just a lot of very fast fluctuations, and your distribution of burst durations is gonna diverge at the origin. You're just gonna pick up a lot of events. Technically, this is a 1D stochastic differential equation driven by white noise. You can get infinite crossing rates. So you don't want that. So you have to put the bar kind of out of the noise. And numerically, we also impose that a burst be at least 2 cycles of the gamma rhythm to call it a burst, okay? And we say, let's set a threshold. And what is the time it takes to go to a typical maximum and back down? The typical maximum you can get from this distribution. And you write this as a first passage time problem. You say, okay, here's a reflecting boundary. This is the absorbing boundary. How long does it take to get from here to here on average? If you have a fluctuation in the envelope dynamics that causes this excursion of the envelope, i.e. causes a burst. And then once you're here, you can ask, well, how long does it take to come back down? And then you can add these 2 random quantities together. And that's the result here. In terms of the parameter R, which is this meta parameter, and the exponential integrals and so on. So you can get this expression. And here, the red is a theory. So you can look at the burst duration. Here's the burst duration when you're far from the bifurcation. So the green and the red don't match perfectly well because there's lots of approximations here. In this regime and the other regimes, it's actually matching better and better. So the theory is not too bad, to give you an idea. Okay, now I wanted to say something. Yes, so this calculation, while we were doing this, we discovered a paper that was in the archive on a new way to calculate passage times back to the same point, because there was no technique to really do that. What you would really want is a passage time problem where you leave a point and you come back to the same point. So now we've done the calculation for that, and that's being written up now, but that's actually going to be an improvement on this kind of partial solution to the problem where you're summing two random times together to produce the whole time, which is not exact, of course. Okay, so that's coming soon. All right, so the basic idea is you're approaching the hop, the burst durations get longer, and you have a theory that can approximate pretty well what's going on. All right, if you look at the numerics, you can again ask, what regime is the system operating in under healthy conditions? So when you're far away from the hop, you get these burst duration frequency distributions, which actually are segregated into, or they kind of disjoint, it seems. But as you get closer and closer and closer to the bifurcation, notice that the range of frequencies shrinks because the oscillation is getting more and more regular. This is the gamma range oscillation. So, and this is actually the peak frequency. Before I was showing you the mean, the distribution of frequencies. This is the distribution of peak frequencies, which is another quantity that's often reported in the literature. The peak frequencies are, of course, higher than the distribution of of frequencies per se, which are the ones I just showed you before, which are more like between 70, 40, and 70. So these ones are a bit higher, okay? But for the burst duration range from 50 to 60 to 150 or so, this looks like a nice sweet spot. This one's pretty good as well, which means we're talking about these 2 points over here. Not too close, not too far from the Hopf bifurcation. This is assuming that we're just changing the parameter WEE here. Okay. Now, so I'm going to summarize now this piece of work, the theory of rhythm bursts. So what we did is we applied the stochastic averaging method to produce envelope phase equations. And you find, as Cindy Greenwood and Lawrence Ward and Mark McDonald found, you have this one-way coupling, but we have the parameterization now in terms of the noise and the other parameters of the problem. There's basically 2 parameters in the problem, if you're looking at the envelopes, which is interesting. They're made up of all the other parameters, of course. And ultimately what defines the distance of the bifurcation is the combination of those 2 parameters, which is R. So there's only one meta parameter in the whole problem. And so this accounts for many observed rhythm features. You can identify an optimal region for the parameter space that produces these stochastic dynamics. And you can do some first passage time analysis to compute the burst durations as a function of the parameters. And you see these burst durations increase as you approach the bifurcation. So you can go back to your favorite surgeon and say, what's a problem? Okay, this distribution is too far that way. How do you move it back? You look at this formula, you say, well, I can change these various coefficients for you. You go back into the equations, say, okay, you need to change this parameter, therefore you can change this, and so on. That's a bit of a pipe dream, but you get the idea, is that you can actually have a handle on the flow from the detailed model all the way up to the burst durations. Or you can just do the simulation, as usual. All right. Okay, now caveats, outlook as well. So our approach has been extended to coupled networks, where you can look at phase synchronization and communication between brain areas now. This would be like one area where there's E and I cells that produce gamma. What about 2 areas that are now going to talk to each other using these bursts? That was the subject of the Palmagiano paper. I just gave an example of how you would use this therapeutically, but you would want to develop the theory also to understand how it responds to periodic input. That's what we've been doing as well. Arthur's been doing that for his thesis. You can also apply this to hopefully other models, models that are maybe more, that might have nested rhythms as well, like theta, gamma, that we haven't tried. So the caveats is, what if the network is not a simple EI network? Can the EI description be a good effective description for what's going on? It's not too detailed, it'll capture some aspects of the dynamics, and that's a question. That's actually one of the conclusions that Bogatz's group came up with, is that EI networks, like mass models like Wilson-Cowan, are good effective descriptions for beta rhythms. What about spiking networks? Well, you expect some similarity, but probably some differences. What if you throw in the nonlinearity? What does that do? And of course, the plasticity. So those are other things that we haven't done and could be tried. Here's an example of what we're doing now, is like, here's an EI network. Here's another EI network. They're in different parts of the brain, and they're linked by some channels, some axons. And there's a delay, propagation. And so you have E to E and E to I couplings. And you can say, okay, how are the bursts on the left going to travel to the and influence the right? And who's going to synchronize who? So it turns out that you can actually do the theory for this. You can say, okay, here's an example where the delay between the 2 is 1 millisecond and the 2 rhythms actually locked in phase. But if you put the delay a bit too long, like 3.5 milliseconds, then you get this out of phase. They're not anti-phase, they're out of phase. And you could do the theory for this. Now you have two envelope phase equations, one for population 1 and one for population 2, and they're coupled with all this stuff. There's 4 diffusion processes, there's delays and so on. Some heavy nonlinearities with this stuff multiplied by Z and so on. So but it's doable, and actually you can plot out bifurcation diagrams. I'm just giving you an example here. This is for the limit cycle regime, where you're changing the delay, and you're going to go from an in-phase state to out of phase to eventually reach an anti-phase state. And if you have noise, you're going to move these bifurcation points over. A subject I fell in love with when I was doing my PhD thesis, trying to understand oscillations in a neural reflex, where the noise was, determining where the bifurcation was. For the coupled quasi-cycles, which is what this theory is about, you can get the same thing. The noise is going to induce these out of phase rhythms. Without noise, you only get in phase or anti-phase. And that comes out of the theory. So if you're interested, I can send you this paper. Okay. I'm going to move on now to, so any questions on this part, or you want to keep them to the end, but if anything burning now?
Is it possible to ask a question right now?
Of course.
Thank you. As far as I understood, this noise you described is actually shooting out from the stable point into Hopf verification area, and by that providing sort of those bursts you mentioned, which are very important for the communication and many activities.
That's one way to say it, yes.
My question is, which actual physical processes do you see under those abstract Gaussian you introduced? Do you have any sort of guesses in that way? You don't think it's actually Brownian, yeah? So
we chose Brownian motion, so therefore Gaussian white noise in the dynamics, because it's the easiest thing to do. So, and we can do theory with it without, extending the dimensionality of the problem. So, but the picture that I have is in my head is you don't really need a Hopf bifurcation. It could be a purely linear system, actually. And as long as you have complex conjugate eigenvalues, the noise is going to kick the system around. And whenever it gets kicked by the noise, it's going to relax in an oscillatory manner and gets kicked again. Right. This just happens to be, the regime you see near Hopf bifurcation. Another way to see it is that the noise, effectively is like it's a noise on the parameters, and you're kind of going and sweeping across the Hopf and coming back. That's maybe another better picture of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly, what I mean, if this process of, jumping in beyond the Hopf verification, should it be some pretty strong process behind those Gaussians, which might be shifting some? No?
You don't need to. Well, I mean, if you look back here, you see, if you're far from the Hopf bifurcation and you keep the noise level the same, you're going to just fluctuate a little bit, right? And if you get closer and closer, the same noise is going to cause a bigger change here. So the noise, the manifestation of the noise is going to be different whether you're far or near.
Okay.
Right. So if you're near the bifurcation, a bit of noise is going to actually excite the oscillations a lot already. You're going to get these blue oscillations. You're welcome. Okay.
I have a question. Can I have a question, André?
Hey, John.
Yeah, hi. So we are operating close to a Hopf bifurcation here in this EI network, right?
Yeah.
This is not the usual picture of ping of Coppell and colleagues. This seems to me a little bit more close to Wang and Brunel, where It's not like the E cells fire and then the I cells fire and shut down the E cells, right? These are modulated sinusoidal-like rate of E's and I's. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I have a question. What about, can you do just ing like this?
We did it. We mentioned it in the paper. So if you do just ing, you have to, well, okay, I'll back off. We haven't done it. We haven't done the theory because there's no theorem that we know about with the stochastic averaging method that guarantees that the result is good when there's a delay.
Yeah.
So if you have the delay, and I know that was one of the things you mentioned in your paper, you need the delay with ing. That's one way to get ing. It's an easy way to get ing. Otherwise, you have to deal with these, the phase lockings of the eye to eye synchronization, which is harder because you need the nonlinearity. So, and so we're thinking about doing that, but we're on unstable ground because we don't know that no one's shown that actually works. That the stochastic averaging method can be extended to delayed system. We've looked and we haven't seen it. If anybody knows, let me know.
Another question I have is, not to take too much time, but hey, this is really fun. Thanks a lot, Andre. This is great.
You're welcome.
Eye cells in some slice experiments show intrinsic resonant properties.
Yeah.
And there's stories about, if your eye cells have their own intrinsic resonance and it happens around gamma, you'd think you'd get a much more stable and robust gamma rhythms. Is there any way with a Wilson-Cowan-like rate model to incorporate intrinsic properties like that?
Well, I don't think so. I think you'd have to have at least a 2D model for the eye cell, right?
Yep.
And then you'd be dealing with 3D, which is maybe okay. But you'd have to have a resonator for the eye population. I think you can come up with, it's probably been done. I mean, but I don't know it. And I don't know if it's been done with noise either. Yeah. I can come back to your first question though. This, the Coppell Whittington picture for the EI, for the ping, it does look a little bit like that as well. We wrote a paper in 2015 in Neurosci, where we took actually the Wilson-Cowan formulated with the noise, with the Markovian chain. And you can see these phase relationships between the E and the I. Now we've kind of linearized, and I'm not sure how much of that phase relationship is left after you've linearized. But it is there before you linearize. But maybe not as strongly as in the Wang-Brunel.
Right, but the point is that when you're doing spiking networks that have these properties, the E cells tend to fire together, and then the I cells, and then the inhibition field wanes, right? But in the Wang-Buzaki, you look at individual cells and you can't see rhythmic pattern, right? Because the individual cells are participating in sort of an asynchronous fashion into this network rhythm.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they're not firing at high rates. They're kind of sampling.
Right. They're skipping.
They're like subharmonics of the population rhythm, but they're each contributing to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to say a few words on inferring EI networks or other networks from spike trains. So this is work by my student Alexandre René in collaboration with Jacob Macke. So he was in Bonn and he was in Munich when I was giving this talk last time, and now he's in Tübingen. So that's where I think he's going to stay. So you have microscopic data, individual spike times, And you use these data to construct population responses. I'm going to show you exactly what that means right away. So you have a microscopic model with excitation inhibition. There's going to be adaptation in the model. This is going to be a generalized integrate and fire model. And you're going to throw the dice at every time step to decide whether the cell fires or not. So there's an escape noise. This is not a stochastic differential equation. This is more the spike response formulation of neural dynamics. But the idea is that you can generate a whole raster here of spikes as a function of time, okay, for E cells and I cells. And then you can sum all these activities and you get the population activity. Now, from this population activity, you want to infer a mesoscopic model. For example, the one that I just showed, the Wilson-Cowan, where you would have, maybe 4 populations, maybe 2 E populations and 2 I populations. And you want to use this to infer these connections. And you can use that to simulate here to see if you're doing okay. But the missing point where a lot of theorists are working on is how to relate the microscopic to the mesoscopic. So you have neural mass models, neural field models, all kinds of approaches here to get from here to here. So the idea is if you have equations that go from here to give you a mesoscopic dynamics, then you can fit the mesoscopic dynamics off of these data, off this population data, right? So, so in order to do this, so you find a theory that models population response at the mesoscopic level, like Wilson-Cowan or spike response models, in terms of microscopic responses, but you must be able to write a likelihood of observed activities because you're going to formulate the problem as a maximum likelihood. And you're going to use this likelihood to fit the parameters of the mesoscopic model. And you can add, adaptation and other things of interest if you can actually do this theory to go from here to here. It turns out there's a theory that has been done for this by Thilo Schwalger and in Wolfram Gerstner's group. And I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes going into detail on every single box here. No, just kidding. It's a complicated model, okay? You have inputs down here. You have neurons that just fired, and they're refractory. And then there are free neurons, the ones that are free from refractoriness, and they're ready to fire a lot more. And then the activity of these free neurons is going to influence the rate at which you can produce more spikes in the next time steps, because the refractory ones aren't ready to go yet. And then there's a whole scheme to correct for finite size. Okay. In a nutshell, I won't go into the details. It's a generalized, integrate and fire. You define spike trains. You define synaptic responses, which are exponential here. You define synaptic inputs. You can write down the potential for one neuron. So it's integrate and fire, a synaptic input, and external currents. But you also add a threshold. So whenever the neuron fires, you can say the threshold went up and then comes back down. And then this is the key point that makes the whole problem stochastic, is you have an escape rate. This is like throwing the dice at every time step. It's a Poisson process that's inhomogeneous in time, and this is the rate. And the rate is an exponential of the distance between the voltage and the current state of the threshold. And this model, keeps the whole history of firing to some extent. I mean, when you do the microscopic simulation, in mesoscopic, it does what's called a quasi renewal approximation. The idea is that you go, you write down if you have a data sequence of length L and a finite history S and a starting time K0, this data sequence has this probability. is the product of the probability, given the histories, of getting a certain number of spikes at each time step from the population. And you multiply that across all time and all populations. So, but the dynamics are in here, is estimating this quantity here, which you use as a binomial statistic, say how many spikes are fired by the population at each time, given what the current escape rate is for everybody. Okay, so that's beautiful work. And then you do stochastic gradient. I wrote ascent here, depends how you look at it. You do stochastic gradient descent to basically fit the parameters using this probability. We have a 2 population test and a 4 population test in our model. You don't try and estimate all the parameters. You probably won't get out of the woods. You have to make some assumptions, but the weights are often what you want to know, and you can try and estimate the weights. Membrane time constants are often very difficult to estimate. There's lots of work by Peter Lansky, Suzanne Ditlevsen, and others. We've played this game as well, tried to figure out how to estimate membrane time constants in various ways using stochastic optimal control. And so we're going to let this system try and figure out if you can estimate the time constants. And the synaptic time constant, the noise level, these are things you can estimate in bold here. So you either have like a 2 population or 4 population model. And you can train with, for example, a noisy sinusoidal input. Here's a noisy sinusoidal input, okay? And you train the model with lots of data from the rasters. This is the microscopic model. You create these population activities. And then you try and do the maximum likelihood as a function of iteration here for the different parameters you're trying to fit. And you try with different priors. I mean, that prior is a big part of the picture here. How do you choose the priors for this? But these are different initial conditions. And you see some of them go off and they never come back to anything interesting. But a bunch of them do converge to the ground truth, which is in black here. Now, there's 2 ground truths. There's the ground truth of the microscopic model, what you put into the detailed model to begin with. Then there's a theory that takes the microscopic model and transfers it to the mesoscopic model and produces a mesoscopic ground truth. We're trying to fit the mesoscopic model. Therefore, we compare to the mesoscopic ground truth. So you can do this, and then you can test whether the system can actually generalize. So you trained it with sine wave force data, and it learns what's going on. And then you can drive it with low pass filtered noise, and you can see how well it's doing in response to this. And you can quantify this with a correlation coefficient or with a root mean square error. And that's what happens. So it turns out you can do pretty well. Actually, with 20,000 spikes, you're actually starting to get pretty reasonable data here. So this is like 1.25 seconds of training at the top. And then as you go down, you go to 9 seconds of training, which is about 20,000 spikes. And you're reproducing a lot of the fluctuations that are seen in the model, in the microscopic model. Okay, so you have root mean square error as a function of the length of the data set you feed is going to go and converge to some value down here. And likewise, the correlation coefficient between the input that you give and the firing rate of the network also converges. Now, this is an interesting thing we find, is that the system can deal with heterogeneous populations. So the model assumes, so the theory of Schwalger assumes homogeneous parameters. If you throw in heterogeneous parameters, for example, you make the 3 time constants behave log normally. So you just pick different time constants and assign them to all the neurons. Then you look at what the meso population does, and then you look and you try and fit that. Well, what you can do, this is the, you can just try to take the average of the parameters and see how the meso theory works. And this is the actual microscopic response here in dark red. This is the standard deviation around it. If you just take the average of the parameters, that doesn't work. Doesn't work too well. Not surprising if you're doing log normal distributions, the averages don't mean much. But this is an important point, is that averages doesn't necessarily get you where you want. But if you let the model infer, actually, it's going to do a better job. It has more room to maneuver to find a proper setup of parameters. Here's an example where you take the mean parameters, the root mean square error 5.84, and then you have the two populations here, the blue and the red, the excitatory-inhibitory. But with inferred, you actually do better. The root mean square error went down. Here you just inferred these missing parameters. You can actually have more room to navigate and find a proper solution if you infer all the parameters, rather than just these two that you made heterogeneous. So the error went down even more. So the moral of the story is fitting more parameters, 14 times 3, 14 because you have 14 for this two population model, 3 because you have these 3 time constants. It takes more time, but you have more opportunities to accommodate model mismatch. The final point I'm going to make about this is you can use this Bayesian inference to characterize the uncertainty and correlations between the parameters. So you can do what's called Monte Carlo sampling, Markov Chain Monte Carlo. I won't get into the details, but you can look at marginals of 2 parameters at a time. And notice some of them are like pretty round, but other ones are elongated, which means that, for example, this parameter, when it's high, the other parameter should be low. So you're going to pick out, the fitting procedure actually picks out some of these correlations that happen for certain, for various connectivities and so on. This is, those of you who've seen the work of an Eve Marder's group, it's important to include the correlations between the parameters. If you take the mean of all the parameters and try and make your network run, you're not necessarily going to get the right thing. But if you pick one high and the other one low, that tends to work better. Okay. We've done this for 4 parameters, four populations as well. This model of 36 3 parameters, and we get reasonable results. But the challenge is what if this model is incorrect? The assumption of the EI model might be completely wrong to begin with. There might be too many populations. Again, you're looking for an effective description, and an effective description might be good enough. Depends what you're looking for. If you have a much more detailed model and you're trying to infer a much more detailed model, you might be overfitting. You might run into problems finding with multiple minima. So on and so forth. So, but there's a real challenge here. And the other challenge is, what if you have, you don't have access to every population, which typically you don't. We're getting better at it now with optogenetics, but this is still an outstanding problem. How do you deal with partial information? So Alexandre actually has one of his other projects is on this. What if you're missing like one population? What can you say? It'd be nice to be able to do this online during an experiment as well, or during surgery, even more. To infer, for example, the parameters of the EI network, to go back to the first part of my talk and look at the influence on the birth statistics. That would be cool. Okay, now I promised a little surprise at the end here, not advertising the abstract. And I'll finish this in just, 5 minutes. Is that okay, Anwar?
Yes, that's fine.
All right. So we have, so I've been talking about stochastic limit cycles quite a bit here. Actually, stochastic limit cycles or quasi-cycles, an oscillation with noise, some noisy thing that has a rhythm you can see in it and you can measure it. spectrally in other ways. So we looked at EI networks and coupled EI networks with delays. I'm going to show you another way that you can get a limit cycle, which I haven't seen yet in the literature, but if anyone has seen it, please let me know. So the context is nonlinear control systems with delay. Now, we were inspired by this problem here. Half of my department does photonics and extreme photonics. And these are two people in my department. Steven Mihailov and Joey Bao. What they look at is chaotic semiconductor lasers that have, they're fed back onto themselves with a fiber, an optical fiber. And the optical fiber has a random grating in it, which causes multiple scattering sites. And in the language of mathematicians, this means multiple delays. Here's a picture of what the thing looks like. Okay, there's like a laser cavity here, okay? There's like a laser with an optic fiber coming back, but you have this other little path where the light can go out, scatter on these etchings that they put in the optic fiber, and then bounce back. And what this does is it adds a whole distribution of delays, a random distribution of delays. And you can get these lasers, semiconductor lasers, to produce fixed points, limit cycles, chaos, hyper chaos, all kinds of fun things. And people are using them, especially with delays, and people are using them to generate random numbers in like all optical computing, for example. So optical random number generators using the high dimensional chaos. Okay, so what does this have to do with anything? Well, you can take your favorite model of a laser, semiconductor laser with optical feedback. And I'm just going to show this for you. There's two equations, but there's a delay here. And you're summing m delays. So there's m delays on the thing here. And that's in the experimental paper. And we're doing this numerically. I'm trying to do a little bit analytically. But it doesn't matter. You can take the Mackey-Glass equation, for example, and just throw in a bunch of extra delays here. Instead of one delay, you have a bunch of random delays. And it turns out, let me just show you the example here. This is Mackey-Glass. And you're increasing the number of delays. This is Mackey-Glass with 680 delays. X of t versus x of t minus the average delay now, okay? And this is very much chaotic. We've done various measures on this. CAMBAM actually figured out a way to do the Lyapunov exponent estimations for multi-delay systems. And I can send you the paper on this if you're interested. 700 delays, 710 delays, something weird starts to happen. 800 delays, you're kind of getting a limit cycle again. So you're going into this regime where you get more and more and more delays. The system is looking more and more like what we call a distributed delay system or an integral differential equation. And at this level, it looks like a stochastic oscillation. Here's an example in the laser. We go from chaos here, here's the attractor. And here's the attractor. If you increase the number of delays to 160, you get this stochastic limit cycle. It looks like a stochastic limit cycle. Okay? So the moral of this story is, if you add more and more delays to a system, you're going to make it more likely to be chaotic. But if you add too many, it's going to come back down the other side and produce limit cycle like behavior. But that thing is not noise, because there's no noise in the problem. It's high dimensional chaos. So random looking oscillations may also be the result of multiple delayed feedbacks in the problem. And I'll leave you with that. Actually, the transition can happen fairly abruptly from chaos to limit cycle with this chaotic fuzz around it. So adding delays increases complexity generally, the complexity peaks for finite, possibly large number of delays, but the chaotic attractor is replaced by what appears to be a limit cycle that has some thickness to it, some fuzz, which is not noise because there's no noise in the problem. The mean seems to trace out a limit cycle with a blur around it, which is the hyperchaos still present, but at a small amplitude. And this is another way to obtain random network oscillations, and the brain has plenty of room to do this as well, because as we know, there's lots of delayed feedback pathways with multiple delays between structures that could, potentially do this. So with that, I will stop and take more questions.
Okay, thank you very much, André. I'm assuming the people who are sticking around, they don't have anything else to do right now, so feel free to ask questions. I'll keep mine until the end, but just go ahead. Anybody would like to ask questions? Okay, André, maybe I'll ask mine then. Some while people, there's someone who would like to ask a question. Okay, Bella, just go ahead.
Yes, André, you covered a lot of ground and it's really interesting. The last one, so I'm curious, you take a random set of delays. Now, did you try a different sets of random delays? And what's the important parameter, the mean? Each of these random sets probably has a mean and some widths of distribution or something?
That's right.
So you could, the limit cycle, can you correlate the limit cycle with the moments of your random delays, or how did you analyze it?
That part hasn't been done yet. We've tried different distributions for a given variance and played around.
Vary the variance.
Yeah, and played around with the mean. And then we've looked at another limit where the delays are kind of more regular spaced instead of randomly spaced. And then you can change the size. I don't know if you still see my screen here.
Yes.
But you can.
We still see your screen.
This is a system with distributed delay, and you're making the distribution of delays broader and broader and broader, and you can get the same effect as you're varying the width of the delay distribution. But here the delays are not randomly assigned; they're regularly assigned. So there's a lot of things we don't understand about this yet, and that, such as more detailed answer to this question, I don't have.
But in Bao's group, when she does get some fixed frequency out of it, right? From her.
Well, she gets completely chaotic.
Yeah, but when she increases the number of delay, does she get into a limit? Or she doesn't see a limit?
No, she doesn't see the limit cycle, but she didn't increase the number of delays.
Okay, fine, thank you.
These problems have quantum noise as well, so experimentally it's a bit more difficult. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, André.
Yeah. Hi, Michael.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
That last slide that you showed with the small amplitude thing that was not a limit cycle, could that be a torus? Because in the second column, I'm not quite sure what you're plotting there, but it looks like something there that looks to me like it's kind of quasi-periodic behavior.
So in the Mackie glass example, it might be some kind of torus, and it wouldn't be too surprising.
Well, actually, it's a slide just after that. Is the one I'm referring. It's a slide just after that one. Oh, no, I guess the order. Yeah, right. Yeah, right there.
You're seeing two frequencies actually in this problem.
Yes, exactly.
So that's a good point. So we actually commented on that in the paper. There's two frequencies. You're picking up kind of a fast frequency mode from it's called the intrinsic frequency of the laser, and then the feedback oscillation as well. And the two are, so one is modulating the other. But if you look at this, it has quite a bit of entropy still. And it's not what you would expect just from two pure frequencies. So yes, there's like a torus in there, but there's some finer scale remnants of the chaos left. I'll leave it at that. It's out here. You could have bifurcated. So you could have bifurcated straight onto a torus, and it certainly looks pretty clean here. This is the autocorrelation function, but there's a bit of fuzz left,
Okay.
which we can't really explain, but it's just some remnant of what was before.
But it's a strictly a deterministic system, isn't it?
That's right.
So then what is the nature of that attractor if it's not a torus?
Well, we don't know because no one has explored these attractors around here with systems with 500 delays or 160 delays. So it's kind of the far west here. We don't really know what's going on. It could be it could be an interaction of remaining modes from the chaotic system. If it'd be great to be able to do a bifurcation diagram here, but we're just stuck doing it numerically. And numerically, there's still some entropy left, which seems a bit different from what you would have just for pure torus behavior. So we don't quite understand it. But on the coarse feature, you're right. It looks like a torus.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question? André, can I ask you a question about the first part of your talk?
Sure.
I mean, you were looking at the Cohen-Wilson model, and you have Gaussian white noise that is associated with it. And you're basically arguing that you have a steady state that has complex conjugate roots, and you have damped oscillation, and as a result, every time now noise pushes you out. Is it possible to get similar kind of scenario if you have an excitable system where you have 3 steady states, one stable and one saddle, and the other one could be a saddle or unstable, where every time the noise could push you away from the stable manifold of the saddle, and you turn around and you come back to the stable steady state. So the noise could push you, but then the time constant of noise, like if you use, let's say, Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process with the proper time constant, wouldn't you be able to get something similar in a way to get these gamma rhythms?
Yes, I think you could, because the basic ingredients here are very simple. Mm-hmm. It's at the bottom of the slide here, complex conjugate with noise. And the specifics of what else is in the landscape here, if you're talking about a fixed point and then another saddle somewhere, and I don't know if you're thinking like a Shilnikov attractor or
exactly.
So then you would you might anticipate even larger excursions that are possible, right? And once you hit the unstable manifold, mm-hmm. and it might look like a stochastic bursty, models of bursting neurons, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think people have looked at a bit with noise. To
be honest, we have a model that has some similar features, and we have these burstive activities as well, similar to what you're seeing. I mean, I don't know if the frequency band that we're seeing is consistent with the gamma rhythms, but the dynamics are similar in a way to this, but the underlying dynamics is different from what you have here.
Yeah, and I would think that the landscape of other singularities around, unstable points and saddles and so on, they're gonna shape the overall dynamics. And if I look at the data honestly here, these distributions are a little bit skewed, some kind of long-tailed. But if you look at the data, they're not, they're a bit more symmetric. They do have a bit more of a tail, but this is going to matter in terms of what else is in the landscape. You might be able to tailor the model to better reproduce the true distribution of the bursts. The other thing is that, this is the result of, the theory is going to give you, it's interesting, the model is linear. You took the Wilson-Cowan equations with noise, you linearized them. So you have a linear stochastic model. But then you look at the envelopes and you're back to a nonlinear stochastic model. And that has these longer tails, right? But the previous step, the fast model without taking the envelopes, that's just going to give you Gaussians for the behavior of your variables. It's when you're looking at the envelope statistics have there's going to be the envelope is going to have a certain shape, the envelope distribution. The burst duration is going to have a certain shape, and I think what you're talking about is that there's different ways of getting to there. Exciting oscillations with noise, and the details may matter in tailoring and reproducing that part of the data.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Any other question? Okay, so thank you again, André, for a great talk. That was really fascinating.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you. Yeah, bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.